Welcome. The word Congo, like the words Timbuktu or Zulu, conjures up all sorts of images in the minds of many of us in the Western world. Whatever the validity or reality behind those images might be, there is no getting around the place's tremendous significance. We pause to focus on the Congo at this particular point because it provides vivid illustrations of the processes we've been examining: conquest, colonization, and decolonization. And in fact, for continuity's sake, we will carry the Congo story further, up to very recent history, up to the present. In other words, to another great theme, which would have to be described as the disappointments of the independence era. And in general, the reason for devoting a full lecture to the Congo, as we did to Ethiopia, is partly because the vividness of its history, its experience with all of these things, its history of conquest, of colonization, of decolonization, its experience since independence seems to be writ large. It's as if the characters and the events in the Congo versions of these general processes are under a magnifying glass or something. They seem larger than life. If you were going to invent a country which wanted to throw into stark relief all of the great themes of modern African history, the Congo might be a good choice to base it on. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment to make a geographical clarification. If you've looked at the map of Africa, of Central Africa, and I certainly hope you have, like most maps, it tells many stories. You may have noticed that there are, in fact, on most political maps of modern Africa, two countries labeled or marked Congo. So let us sort these out first of all. There are, in fact, two. One, the more northerly country, is the Republic of Congo. The more southerly one is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Republic of Congo, which is more easily referred to as Congo-Brazzaville after its capital city, was a French colony created as a part of during the scramble then, and one of the territories which fell to France as part of French Equatorial Africa. The other, again, perhaps easiest to refer to as Congo-Kinshasa, was begun, as we'll see in a moment, by Belgium's King Leopold and eventually became the Belgian Congo. After independence, known as the Congo for a time, its name, just to further muddy the waters, changed in 1971 by its ruler of the time to Zaire, which is a corrupted version of a name for the Congo or Zaire River. And it stayed Zaire for about a quarter of a century until the ruler whom we'll meet was evicted from power and the country's name changed back to Congo. So I will be referring in this lecture to the Congo-Kinshasa, the former Belgian Congo, the country known as Zaire, and now known again as Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, perhaps the place to start is with some geographical realities. The Congo is a huge place. It straddles the equator, and as most of you know, the countries that are in that bulge of the Earth's middle often get underrepresented, in a sense, in two-dimensional maps. In fact, the Congo-Kinshasa, is as big as the United States east of the Mississippi River. It encompasses a great portion of the world's second largest rainforest, vast savanna belts which run below that rainforest. In the east, we see some of the manifestations of the Great Rift that we talked about early in the course, and major mountain ranges and lakes are part of the geography in the east. In terms of its human geography and history, this vast region was home to numerous major Bantu kingdoms, such as the Luba, the Lunda, the Kuba. With all of this diversity, with this massive scale, perhaps it is little wonder that the Congo has proven to be such a challenge. Now, the modern Congo originates with the rather amazing, almost incredible, and still shocking tale of Belgium's King Leopold II, a man of gargantuan appetites, of huge ambition. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, nor in Africa, but was ultimately responsible for the devastation of the lives of millions. I hope to show that I don't believe that's an exaggeration. And in some respects, he started the country down a path from which, in some respects, it has never recovered. Now, Leopold ascended the throne of Belgium in 1865 upon his father's death, and after a childhood in which he appears to have been, or at least felt, starved of love, as you can imagine, like Shaka Zulu and Cecil Rhodes. He's been the stuff or the object of a number of amateur psychohistorical treatments. He was, I mentioned, gargantuan ambitions. He was a man of gargantuan appetites in the most literal sense. His usual breakfast consisted of 6 poached eggs, an entire rack of toast, and an entire jar of marmalade, matched by lunches and dinner of equal scale. In modern terms, he would probably be called an obsessive compulsive. He was one of those who washed his hands dozens of times a day, who insisted that the tablecloths be boiled after each meal, who, perhaps most curiously, wrapped a bag around his quite lengthy beard when he went out in public if there was dampness or rain. It may be that the felt deprivations or hollowness of his childhood led him to seek fulfillment, to seek validity with grandiose projects. Apparently the kingship of Belgium was not enough. It was a small country after all, and nothing on the scale of the power of Britain or France. To pursue these dreams then, Leopold increasingly turned toward Africa and becomes a major player, a major figure in the scramble for Africa, which we looked at earlier in the course. As early as 1877, before the scramble really has taken off, he wrote to one associate, "I mean to miss no chance to get my share of this magnificent African cake." This magnificent African cake. It's a rather nice image, a useful image, I think, for the era of the scramble for Africa. Now, his first vehicle in doing this was an association which he founded called the International African Association. And he put it forth in a series of meetings very adroitly. Again, whatever one says about Leopold's record or personality, he was a man of great intelligence and great cleverness, and with the ability to attract to him support or at least tolerance for his projects from those with the force of his considerable intellect and considerable charm. He put the International African Association forward as essentially a philanthropic project. This would be an association which in Central Africa would, for instance, combat the slave trade, in this case the ongoing slave trade connected to the East Coast and usually referred to as the Arab Swahili slave trade. It would bring moral uplift. It would bring the advancement of science. It would bring, in other words, the civilizing mission. And as we've seen earlier in the course, this is very much the order of the day, the agenda. So he was putting on the table an additional version of a project justified in precisely those terms in a lot of different places in Africa at that time. Now, in reality, and I will put it that way, his objects were far more material and far more mundane. He sought a fortune in Africa, and his first means of building that fortune was through one of Africa's age-old commodities, will not surprise us, and that is ivory. But eventually, Leopold's project in Africa would be associated with a quite different commodity, and that would be rubber, in this case wild rubber. And as we saw in the case of palm oil, for instance, in the oil rivers and other parts of Nigeria, oil rivers not named for petroleum, which comes out of there now, but for the palm oil which was used to lubricate the rapidly multiplying machines of the industrial age. As with palm oil then, rubber is almost a perfect fit between a product coming out of Africa and the requirements of that industrial age. Obviously, its principal uses exploding at precisely the time, the last decades of the 1800s and first of the 1900s, would be in the automobile and electrical industries. Now, Leopold's territory in Africa came to be known as the Congo Free State, and it was something unique. This was his colony. It was not the possession until later in the story, from 1908 on. It was his personal colony in the center of Africa. So this is not an example of a competition as part of that scramble between governments, as it is a remarkable individual's role in carving out his own Central African territory. Now, his principal agent was none other than someone we've met before. He was born John Rowlands out of wedlock in Wales, but eventually, after travels in America and in Africa, was known to the world as Henry Morton Stanley. And of course, he was the man who found Livingstone, and we met him before in that case. Stanley had become frustrated in his efforts to get the British government to back his own efforts in launching the scramble. The British obviously came on board at a certain point, but he offered his services to Leopold, and a very convenient partnership was born. Stanley's first step in creating the Congo Free State was something we can see as part of the scramble for Africa in many parts, and that was what we might call treaty making. The notion was to go in with a very well-armed force, 2 chiefs, indigenous rulers, and persuade them, one way or another, to agree to a legal document, a treaty, giving certain rights, usually rather shadily defined rights, to the outside power, in this case, to King Leopold. It is fair to say that most of the indigenous rulers he was dealing with were illiterate and probably had very little indication or understanding of what they were, in fact, signing or getting into. In any case, the orders, the instructions from Leopold himself to Stanley were quite clear. And I use Leopold's words here. The treaties must be as brief as possible, and in a couple of articles must grant us everything. Now, in the wake of the diplomatic importance, and that's really what it was, these treaties gave Leopold the ability to put a case forward to have his possession in Central Africa recognized by the other national powers involved in the scramble. And that was really the purpose for doing them. To establish genuine occupation on the ground, on the other hand, Stanley obviously had more difficult work involved, but began to recruit a service of not just Belgians, but frankly, a large army of adventurers, in some cases rogues, I think we could say, who began to man what the Congo Free State called the stations of the interior. They were backed, of course, by military force, and in this case, that force came to be called the Force Publique, which in fact remained the name for the police and military forces in the country until independence in 1960. This was a force which meant business, and it introduced Congolese to, for instance, one instrument which was known as the chicote. It was a longish whip made of hippopotamus hide and shredded at the end in a sort of corkscrew style, and used to deliver the corporal punishment which Stanley and his followers utilized effectively to get the resources that they were after. Rubber is essentially coagulated sap in the wild form. It's now, of course, been replaced first by domesticated production of rubber, and then obviously comes from petroleum today. But in the wild form, it essentially is available in the rubber trees, plentiful in the Congo rainforest, but often up quite high. It's difficult and dangerous work to collect wild rubber. So in a lot of respects, the great obstacle here, or the great object of the game, was to create the labor force which would collect this wild rubber. Here is where the facts of this matter become rather graphic indeed. In order to get men to ascend the rubber trees and deliver the rubber to the agents of the Congo Free State, essentially the agents took hostages, predominantly women, in some cases children, usually the wives or relatives of those, and then insisted upon quotas for the delivery of rubber from the related males. This was, I mentioned the latitude given to the man on the spot in colonial administration generally a lecture or two ago, but this was, this was the man on the spot latitude with a vengeance. Failure to meet the assigned quota resulted often in the loss of one's hand, foot, ears, nose, or in some cases, head. Eventually, whistles began to be blown, and one of the most remarkable of these was the African-American journalist, later historian, George Washington Williams, who actually bought into Leopold's project quite a bit, but went in 1889 to prepare a journalistic report and returned with a bitter open letter which he published about the king, suggesting that the king had in fact been engaging in the slave trade himself internally there. And as Stanley Williams said, his name produces a shudder among these simple folk when mentioned. They remember the broken promises, his copious profanity, his hot temper, his heavy blows, his severe and rigorous measures by which they were mulcted of their lands. Williams was followed by others. E.D. Morrell, who wrote the book Red Rubber, Roger Casement, and eventually what emerged as what you might see as sort of the first international human rights movement came forth. Obviously, the Western world had no objection to colonialism per se at this time, but became so appalled by these excesses that indeed this first human rights movement arose. The pressure eventually led to Leopold turning the Congo over to the Belgian government in 1908. The depopulation from killings, from starvation, from exhaustion, from disease, from plummeting birth rates, was estimated by one scholar, and this is Jan Fonsina, one of the very senior scholars, formerly professor at University of Wisconsin. He considered that the Congo's population may have been cut in half between 1880 and 1920, and that in turn, based on later estimates, would mean a loss of population of something on the order of 10 million. Now, for the next half century, the Belgians reigned over a generally quiet colony. In fact, the Belgian government delegated a substantial amount of its responsibility. The Catholic Church played a huge role, even greater than that missionaries played in other places, not just in education, but certainly in health as well. The Belgians granted gigantic monopoly concessions over vast regions to private firms. Most importantly, Union Minière held exclusive rights over the colony's most lucrative source, copper from the Katanga region. At its best, the system represented a reasonably benevolent and firm, paternalism. Union Minière, for instance, led the way in the stabilization, so-called, of labor, and did indeed undertake the creation of, in many respects, quite well-run company towns where education and healthcare and so forth was available. This was, in a way, the Belgian version of the developmentalist state that we saw in the case of the late French and British empires. The Belgians, however, were not interested, probably even less than others, in so-called troublemaking, and were particularly resistant to the notion of African involvement in politics. As a result, when the winds of African nationalism began to blow in the 1950s, the Belgians at first cracked down hard and then permitted only the most modest exercises in local elections. Political parties were legalized only in August of 1959. Then, astonishingly, the Belgians announced in January 1960 that independence would be granted in 6 months. The Belgians had done virtually nothing to prepare the nation for independence. If France and Britain eventually showed a haste to decolonize, Belgium showed something close to panic. The notion that they might be faced for another generation or two with constantly escalating demands and so forth led them to make the political turnover in the hope, as we've seen before, of retaining as much of the economic possibilities as they could. Given the size and the diversity of a country with less than a dozen university graduates in 1960, what followed was perhaps predictable. Now, the first person elected in these hastily organized elections was a former clerk named Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was, in many respects, a radical. He voiced a vision of a genuine revolutionary sort, and as you might imagine, this did not endear him to either the departing Belgians or those in the West. The context we must introduce here, of course, is the Cold War. 1960 is in the heart of this epochal competition between the Western Bloc and the old Soviet Union bloc, of course, for influence all over the world. And eventually, both the Soviet Union and Western powers, including the United States, would install or support or back up or give aid to leadership and leading to situations which can hardly be called admirable. The first proverb I ever learned out of Africa was something like this: when two elephants fight, it's the grass beneath the feet which suffers. And it was directly put forward in reference to the Cold War. Lumumba immediately faced crises. The army mutinied within the first 2 weeks when the old Belgian officer wrote on a blackboard in front of them, "Before independence equals after independence." In other words, we're going to continue to have Belgian officers and so forth. The younger members of that army wanted promotions and wanted to see the fruits of this hastily arranged independence immediately, and Lumumba was faced with a crisis. Soon enough, the Katanga, the copper-bearing region in the far south, declared its independence. Again, in this case, with quite direct Belgian support, the landing of official Belgian troops to try to break away from the Congo. They were supported by numerous mercenaries drawn from South Africa and southern Rhodesia. Certainly, the attitudes and ideologies of Lumumba, as I said, earned him the enmity of not just the Belgians, but the Americans. These were amply documented in the church hearings between 1975 and 1978 on the Central Intelligence Agency. President Eisenhower, for instance, is recorded at one meeting after a briefing asking if, quote, "we can't get rid of this guy," unquote. The Belgian foreign minister, in a document unearthed later, said that, quote, "responsible authorities had the duty to render Lumumba harmless. Well, eventually the triggers are pulled by Congolese themselves, given the support of the external powers. And Lumumba was assassinated in early 1961 after something like 6 months in office. There ensued a half-decade of incredibly complex chaos. If you lived through the early 60s, the headlines each day seemed to be a kind of revolving door of movements and secessions and interventions and different leadership and so forth. Behind the scenes, though, a shrewd young army officer, originally known as Joseph Désiré Mobutu, was consolidating his power. He visited Washington, actually met with President Kennedy in 1963. In November of 1965, he pulled off a bloodless coup d'etat. Thus began 32 years, no less, of Mobutu's regime. We asked in the last lecture what Africa's new rulers would do with their power, and we will see that the answers to that are variable and changeable. In Mobutu's case, the answers are clear and disheartening. Internally, Mobutu was quite prepared to hammer any opposition, but he also, again, a man of great intelligence and political skill, rewarding allies, buying off rivals, adept at both the carrot and the stick. Internationally, he played the geopolitical game very cleverly again, adroitly positioning himself as a friend of the West to keep the Cold War era aid coming. He developed a cult of his own personality and, in fact, dropped the Joseph Désiré to his name and became known officially as, listen for all of it, Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbanda Wazabango, meaning the all-conquering warrior who triumphs over all obstacles. An alternative translation, which I actually think is more accurate, is the strutting rooster who covers all the hens, going from battle to battle, leaving enemies in his wake. Above all, Mobutu lined his pocket on a colossal scale, becoming literally one of the richest men in the world, a fortune estimated at certainly over $4 billion dollars. Most of the wealth wound up in European banks and real estate. Eventually, the center could not hold. The corruption at the top percolated to every level of Congolese society. Mobutu had become, by the 1990s, something of a caricature, even an embarrassment to his Western supporters. And Zaire, as he had renamed the country, I would say essentially ceased to exist by the 1990s. A rebellion launched from the east in 1997, again with some external participation, in this case by neighboring African countries, quickly drove him into exile, and he died shortly thereafter. Since Mobutu's fall, alas, things are little better. A major civil war, complicated by spillover from Rwanda and Rwanda's genocide in 1994, and other Great Lakes countries, has festered. Congo has always been a target for external interest because of its enormous mineral resources in things like copper, diamond, and these days in coltan, a crucial element which is found, for instance, in every cell phone. I don't have to tell you how strategic that has become in the last decade or so. In fact, in the civil war which has emerged in the Congo in the 1990s and essentially continues off and on with sporadic ceasefires and breakdowns again, there are numerous nations that have forces inside the Congo, including at least 5 other African nations. We have, in a sort of perverse sense here, a kind of perverse rendition of the era of Leopold and of the scramble. As you might imagine, over the years I've had a great number of students in my classes, ordinary undergraduate classes from Africa. And as you might imagine, I rely on them, I turn to them, I ask them to supplement my obviously limited knowledge with their own. I often ask them to give presentations about their countries. I have to say the only ones that I've ever seen break down in tears for their home countries are the students who have begun to tell their fellow students about the Congo. Let us hope that the next generation brings better times. Thank you.